Let me welcome everyone this morning. I am Pastor Girley and Esquire Girley, but today I'm just an instructor, a fellow student with you as we look again for a second time, part two of our continuing conversation that we've entitled Africa's Contribution to the People and the Places of the Bible. Why is it necessary? Well, it's the truth that we as a race, the Black race, we're involved in God's plan from the very inception. We are not an accommodation and an adaptation, but we've been involved from the beginning. We are involved now, and we will be involved throughout eternity. I think that the last passage that we read in Isaiah at the end of our last session kind of pointed to that. We looked last time at Kemet, which we know today is Egypt, and we looked at Cush. And those countries were important because they figure and they loom largely in the Old Testament biblical discussion. We noted that Moses was born in Kemet, and that for the first 40 years of his life, and needless to say, the formative years of his life, but for 40 years of his life, he spent learning things. And that was not just coincidental or accidental, but that was by divine design. On another day, we can talk about the fact that wherever you are in life, that in terms of your finances, in terms of your employment, in terms of the very family that you were born in, and in terms of your geographical location, that is likely the place where God wants to do something in you and perhaps through you. So never take it for granted that this is just a place, I just happen to be here, I can go wherever I want to go and do whatever I want to do, when in fact, your location where you're living today, the people that you are surrounded by might in fact be your duty assignment from a divine perspective. Now today we're going to talk about three individuals who were royalty, kings. When I say royalty, I mean kings. These people are, two of them are discussed in the Bible. One of them is referred to indirectly, and I'll tell you why. So who are the three people that we're going to discuss today? Well, we're going to talk about Melchizedek or Melchizedek, depending upon whose interpretation or pronunciation of the Bible that you are referring to. Melchizedek is an interesting character because he is mentioned in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, chapter 14, and we're going to go there in just a moment. But to understand why we are including him in our conversation, we kind of have to do a little bit of review. So let's do that review. And let's put Melchizedek in his genealogical context. Melchizedek was the king of, and we're going to see that, the city of Salem. Salem, you know that place because ultimately it became Jerusalem. So then if you put the term Jerusalem together, looking at the back part of the second part of that word, Salem, we know that that word actually also means peace. And we're going to read in just a moment where the book of Genesis refers to Melchizedek or Melchizedek as the king of Salem or the king of peace. One of the questions that I have in our study guide is, what are some of the titles that is used to describe or to refer to Melchizedek? And one of them, I'm giving you an answer right now, is the king of peace. So let's see if your instructor can get right to the material and share with you his screen. How about now? Do you see something that says Melchizedek?
Yes.
All right, I'm so sorry for that delay, but now we're going to click on the Bible, and this is Genesis chapter 14. Uh, can you see Genesis chapter 14, verse 17? Class?
Yes.
Okay, so let's read that. And I'll read it and just read along with me. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Sheva, which is the king's dale. Now, 14:18 is where we want to focus on. And Melchizedek, who is the king of what? And I just told you that, the king of Salem. We know that now to be a reference to Jerusalem, brought forth bread and wine. And he was the priest also. And here's what's very important. He was the priest of who? The Most High God. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram, not Abraham, because he wasn't Abraham at that point. Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which had delivered thine enemies into thine hand, and he gave him a tithes of all. So a couple of interesting things are happening, and let me stop sharing. He said, blessed be Abram. Now, the reason for that that's so significant is that this is the first time that we see someone paying tithes in the Bible. Which is kind of interesting because some people say that tithes is something that began in the law, and therefore, since the law, Christians are not under the law anymore, you don't have to pay tithe. Well, that's a conversation for another day, but it suffices to say that tithing is an expression of your devotion and your appreciation to God, and a recognition that every good and perfect thing that happens to you, that comes to you, is from God himself. So tithing is not something that began under the Mosaic law. But what's interesting about this is that Abram, who is this great man in the Bible, pays tithes to this, shall we say, mysterious, nebulous figure. But we're now talking about Melchizedek. Now we know that Jerusalem was located in what is considered Canaan, or was Canaan. And if we go back to last year's conversation, what we saw was that Ham had 4 sons, right? His sons were Cush, which we discussed the descendants of one of his sons last week when we discussed Kemet and Cush. Mizraim was another name for Egypt. Again, we talked about the fact that Egypt is a name that the Greeks gave to the people who lived in Kemet. Mizraim was the name that Noah gave, or I'm sorry, it was Ham. Ham gave to his son. But Mizraim and Kemet, same place, same people. So Ham had 4 sons: Cush, Mizraim, Phut, or P-H-U-T, or sometimes I've seen it pronounced or spelled P-U-T, Put. But scholars differ in terms of where Put was. Some say it's modern day Libya. Some say that it was Somalia, Djibouti, in the southern part of Ethiopia, the modern day country. But what we can know for sure is that it was somewhere in Africa, right? So all of Ham's sons were in Africa, or what is referred to as the Levant. And that's a term that I've introduced into our studies. What is the Levant? Well, it's the land mass or the land strip that connects Africa to Europe. What is that? That's Jordan, that's Israel, that's Syria, and that's Lebanon. Those countries today are in the Levant. But what we know about the Levant is that Ham's 4th son, Canaan, settled there. And so all of Canaan's sons formed nations there. And ultimately, in the book of Exodus, when the children of Israel come out of bondage out of Egypt, they go and they conquer the Levant, or Palestine, what we know today as Palestine. But one of the places ultimately that they conquered is Jerusalem. But Canaan was a black man. How do we know that Canaan was black? And therefore, everybody that lived in Canaan was black, and that includes Melchizedek. It's simple genealogy. If Canaan's father was black, his brother Cush was black, his brother Kemet was black, or Kemet or Mithram was black, then how could he be anything other than black? How could Canaan's descendants be anything other than black? Now, we know also that throughout time there was intermarrying, okay? I mean, that's just something that happens, that's human behavior, right? So, for example, if we fast forward in time 1,000 years from now, and historians and archaeologists are trying to figure out who were the people who lived in North America, would it be accurate to say 1,000 years from now that the people that lived in North America were Native Americans and only Native Americans? Yes and no, because you'd have to ask an additional question in terms of what time were you talking about, right? If you're talking about in the 1300s and the 1400s, then pretty much that's going to be accurate. The people that were living in North America exclusively were Native Americans. But if you're talking about right now, there are a lot of different people, including Native Americans, who are living in North America. So that concept of people moving around the globe, that applied all around the world. So, but when Canaan was first peopled or first populated, and certainly at the time that it was set up, it was peopled by the descendants of Ham, black people, okay, making it painfully obvious. Now, Western biblical scholars have gone to great lengths to come up with all of these wild theories about why Melchizedek could not have been black. But none of those theories that they advance have any biblical support. One of them is that they say that Melchizedek was actually Shem, the eldest son of Noah. But there is no biblical reference to that at all, okay? At all. But that would make him something other than black. And some people have said, and I was listening to a lecture just yesterday about this, because your teacher likes to be up to date and current as possible. And so I was actually myself listening to a few lectures and reading additional material about Melchizedek yesterday. And I read where someone said that he was actually a Christ himself, who was in a human form prior to his incarnation in Palestine during the time that we know about, which is written in the New Testament. Well, the problem with that theory is, there's many problems with that theory, but one of them was discussed by one of the lecturers, which I thought was good. I thought I would share this with you. One of the requirements for a priest is that he be a man. I mean, a human being, okay? Because the function and the role of the priest is to go to God on the behalf of his fellow human beings. So then Christ, at the time that Abram encountered Melchizedek, had not become a human being. To say that Christ had become a human being prior to the time that he was born through Mary would totally disrupt and topple our theology. The function of the priest is to go to God on the behalf of his fellow human beings. Jesus assumed that responsibility when he ascended back to heaven after he himself had taken on human flesh, after he himself had become fully man and fully God. Now we're getting deep in the weeds of theology, but it's important to note that Melchizedek was not Christ before the New Testament, who had happened to appear to Melchizedek, to Abram. Melchizedek was a man, but not just any man, he was a black man, and I'm stressing that. But now let's talk about that. The first time that the word priest is mentioned in the Bible, it is in reference to Melchizedek, this descendant of Ham, who is the descendant of Canaan. I think it's interesting. Why is it interesting? Because what we're trying to do is inform ourselves and inform our community that not that Black people are more important than all other people, that Black people are in the plan of God, have always been in the plan of God. The way that Christianity has been presented to us historically, ladies and gentlemen, is that God only dealt with two groups of people. And sometimes this is said directly and sometimes it's said subtly, but this is the message that we've gotten, that God has only dealt with and primarily cared about two groups of people, Israel and Europeans. And God has assigned either Israel or white people to inform the rest of the people about who he is. And he's never had any relationship with any other people. Well, this statement that is made about Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14 blows that out the water. Because he is a black man, we don't have to dispute that unless we're going to dispute the genealogy that the Bible presents. I suggest to you that we can take it on its face. He is a black man, and he is referred to in Genesis chapter 14 as the priest of the Most High God. Now, who's the Most High God? God.
God.
If Abram thought that he was a priest of some other imaginary paganist God, why would he pay homage or tithes to a fake or a trickster or a false prophet? We've got to, line it up logically, folks. It's the truth hiding in plain sight, but has never been emphasized because it's not beneficial to those who want to say that we are somehow less important to God. And again, the thrust and the emphasis of this conversation is not that we are more important, but that we are equally important. I want to take you back to my outline because I want to now continue to deal with this man, this black man, the first priest that's ever mentioned in the Bible, Melchizedek. I want to take you back to him because I want you to see what the psalmist says about him. Are you able to see? And I'll go to the chat next in just a moment. Are you able to see Psalms 110:4? No. Okay,
No,
let me share that. What I needed to do was to share my screen with you. So let me do that. I'll come back. So I got to be the technician and everything else today. Let's try that again. How about now?
Okay.
You see it now?
Mm-hmm.
Outline, that's what I want you to see. Now I want to take you to Psalms 104. Can you see Psalms 110:4?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the psalmist is continuing to discuss, and I see that there's a couple of messages in the chat, which we're going to go to next. But the psalmist is discussing this mysterious figure. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent, which means not change his mind. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, who's God talking about here, class? Who's the reference to? Let me continue to read. The Lord at thy right hand shall strike through kings in the day of his wrath. He shall judge among the heathen. He shall fill the places with the dead bodies. He shall wound the heads of many countries. He shall drink of the brook in the way. Therefore shall he lift up the head. Now, just so you know, this is David, David was a psalmist. He was a king. And this kind of plays into the next point that I'm trying to make about Melchizedek. David was a psalmist. He was a prophet. He was a king. He was many different things. But David was also a ruler. And Melchizedek was a ruler as well. let me stop sharing. Let me go to the chat and see what the message is. Y'all stand by. We're going to go to our chat. I'm going to try to. Can you see me while I'm going to the next location?
Yeah.
She was only just saying she could see you when you were asking earlier.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me know, y'all. Cue me if there are any technical issues because I'm multitasking here. But I want to talk a little bit more because we got two more people that we want to talk about. I want to talk a little bit more about Melchizedek. The scriptures say that he was that Jesus, not Melchizedek, but that Jesus was a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So then that raises a question of what kind of priest was Melchizedek? Some people are confused about Melchizedek because the scriptures say that there is no record of him being born. There's no record of him dying. There's no record of the end of his ministry. So some people have read that text to mean that he was supernatural, but you've got to take all of the information about Melchizedek in its context. One of the things that I said to you a moment ago is that one of the requirements, or I would say requirements, I'll leave it there, to be a priest is that you must be a human being. You know, if an angel is interceding on the behalf of a human being, maybe that's permitted, but that is not a function of the priesthood. If a human being is interceding on the behalf of another human being, that is the function of priesthood. Now, we know about, if we read the scriptures, we know about the Levitical priesthood, right? Which was set up with Aaron and all of his descendants. And that was something, what made you qualified to be a Levitical priest is that you had to be a descendant of Aaron. But Jesus was a descendant not of Aaron. You know, if we're talking about the lineage of his earthly mother and father, Jesus was a descendant of David. And David was from the tribe of Judah. So the Bible compares Jesus to Melchizedek, but there's some difference. So in what way was Jesus like this man? Well, think about it. What were the titles that were given to Melchizedek? He was a king.
Prince of Peace.
He was a prince and a priest. So the Levites were not rulers, okay? They were priests, and they functioned in the sanctuary. And the kings were not priests, and they were not permitted to do the functioning and this offering up of sacrifices. So they each had their own lanes. But when it came to this man Melchizedek, he was a king and he was a priest. And in that same way, and this is just Jerry Girley suggesting to you one way that Jesus is like Melchizedek, is that he's a priest. The Bible tells us, in the book of Hebrews tells us that he has ascended into heaven and he is ever interceding on our behalf because he is acquainted with all of the sufferings, all of the frailties of being a human being. He took on human flesh. And though he was tempted in every respect, he was perfect. He did not sin, but he can relate to what it means to be stressed out. He can relate to what it means to be uptight. He can relate to what it means to be hurt, to be personally feeling like I'm not having a good day, because he was human. And the Bible says he was tested in every respect. That's why there's a qualification or requirement to be a priest, that you must first be a human. So, but Jesus is like Melchizedek, and then we're getting ready to move on to our next character here, in that he is a ruler. He's a ruler. He's a king. He's a sovereign. So why I think it's important that we're discussing and studying Melchizedek is that we see that God has had relationships with human beings from all around the world for time immemorial. And if you listen to certain people talk about the Bible, only certain people are important to God. And it's just not true. So again, the purpose of our conversation today, you know, and now I'm speaking as a lawyer. Lawyers like to talk about the record. And I'm now, when I say the record, I'm talking about the historical record. And sometimes when there's inaccuracies in the record, or if the record is incomplete, they will go back and they will correct the record. And so one of the reasons why we're having this conversation is to set the record straight as it relates to Black people, as it relates to Black people's contribution to the people and the places of the Bible. I encourage you to do further study and further inquiry about this remarkable, fascinating man, Melchizedek. Now let's go on to talk about another person that is in our study today, a person named Pi. You've not heard of Pi, but I'm going to introduce you to Pi. He's also referred to Pi, P-I-E-Y-E. He's also referred to as Pianke. Pianke is spelled P-I-A-K-H-E. I've seen it spelled P-I-A-K-Y, K-N, I'm going to say it, P-I-A-N-K-Y. Who is this guy, Pi or Pianke? Well, he is a pharaoh. He is a Black pharaoh. Why are we talking about pharaohs? Because pharaohs are rulers of Egypt. Why are we talking about Egypt? Because Egypt is mentioned 611 times in the Bible. Egypt is a significant place. Why are we talking about Egypt? Because I just read to you last week that Egypt will figure largely in the eternal plan of God. I read to you from Isaiah. So it's important to know, again, when we talk about things that are happening in the Bible, what was the surrounding circumstances. Now, we're going to work our way to our next character, our next interesting ruler, whose name is Taharaka. But to fully appreciate who Taharaka is, you got to know who Pi is. Now, we talked about last week, by way of review, that during the entire existence and the course of Kemet's existence was 3,100 years, give or take. I was looking at something just last night where it said that even before the 3,100 years, where Narmer, N-A-R-M-E-R, who was the first king or the first pharaoh of Egypt, before he joined the Upper Egypt and the Lower Egypt, which we talked about last week, even before that, they've gone back since that time and they found additional tombs and additional graves of pharaohs that existed even hundreds and maybe even thousands of years before that. And they refer to that as Dynasty 0, because they just don't have any idea exactly when these people lived. But even back then, they had written language and they had a high level of civilization and accomplishment. But anyway, during the 3,100 years of existence plus, they had 30 different dynasties. We talked about that last week. But the 25th dynasty was the dynasty that came about as a result of the Kushite kings, who were south of Kemet, coming up, rising up and coming in and actually conquering and taking over Kemet and ruling it for roughly 100 years. Now, so let's talk about the different kings that made up, or the different pharaohs that made up the 25th dynasty, the Black Dynasty. We call it the Black Dynasty only in this sense, that it's not in dispute that these people were Black. As for the rest of the pharaohs, depending upon who you talk to, they were as European as, I don't know, Robert Redford, you know, in terms of how they can portray them in films and literature. But the more credible archaeologists and Egyptologists are coming around to the fact and admitting the fact that the progression of humanity out of Africa, now we're going way back to last year, was from north to south up the Nile River. So the original people that occupied planet Earth were Black, and the original people, therefore, by extension and logical extension, that occupied any place on planet Earth was Black, and that certainly includes Kemet and, of course, Sudan. But still, having, in the face of all of that scientific and archaeological evidence, there's still some people who have questions about who these pharaohs were. But I just kind of want to talk about the illustration that I gave a moment ago. If we ask people 1,000 years from now, say, well, who were the North Americans? It just depends on what time you're talking about. If you're talking about 2022, the Americans, the North Americans, is a diverse group of people. It's a hybrid group of people, right? I mean, people intermarrying, and you've got blacks marrying whites, whites marrying Asians, and Latinos marrying Native Americans. So it's a hybrid. And that's just human behavior, that happens around the world over time if you had diverse groups of people living in close proximity to each other. So who were the Egyptians or the Kemetic people depends on what time in history we're talking about. But at its inception, we know that they were black. We saw Narmer, right? And we're not going to go back to Narmer because Narmer is who Narmer is, and we can't dispute that. It is a settled conversation in my mind. But the 25th dynasty is something that cannot be disputed. And I gave you some information, and I went back to confirm it because I don't want to mislead you. I went back just yesterday to make sure that it was still true, that in Cairo, Egypt, there's a museum of ancient Egypt. And there's representation and relics and different things that are in the museum that come from the different dynasties, these different 30 dynasties that we talked about, with the exception of one, and that is the 25th dynasty. Even in the place where they ruled, Black people, some people are trying to erase Black people from history. But the 25th dynasty existed. It existed, and there were, depending upon who you ask, when it started, but there were 7 pharaohs that made up the 25th dynasty. The first one's name was Alara, A-L-A-R-A, Alara. Now, Alara never actually went into Egypt to conquer it. He stayed home. He ruled from Napata. We talked about Napata, which was the second capital of Kush. And by the way, I never did tell you last week what was the third capital of Kush. Kush's third capital was Meroe. If you look at it, it looks like Meroe. It's M-E-R-O-E, but it's Meroe. That's how it's pronounced. But Alara ruled from Napata. And Alara was the father, the grandfather of those individuals that actually went into Egypt or Kemet and set up rulership and set up their thrones there. Remember, Alara was the head of the Kushite dynasty that was in charge at that time. So after Alara, we had Kashta. Now, I remember those of you who are maybe around my age, a little younger, maybe a little older, you remember Roots, right? That epic ABC docu-series that came out and everybody was just shook by Roots, right? You remember that?
Yes.
And then after that, everybody started naming their children Kizzy and Kuta Kinte and
George.
Chicken. I don't know about Chicken George, but we had an awakening of our African consciousness, and there was something that struck us that said we are missing something, that something has been intentionally suppressed, and it just came out on the scene like a tsunami. And then you had all of these African sounding names. So as I think about that, I thought about some of these names of some of these kings that might be good names for young men today. You had Alara, you had Kashta, you had Shabaka. That sounds like a strong name, right? Shabaka. And you had Pianke. Now, Pianke was a military genius. He And he was also a gifted politician and a diplomat. He discerned, and I talked about this last week, he discerned that Kemet was in a moral crisis because the priest had pretty much given themselves over to pursuing money and material possessions. And the people in Kemet were in distress about that. Those that were not involved in that corruption, who actually were trying to show some devotion and some commitment to their God, were in distress about that. But as I also shared with you, the Cushites and the Kemetic people had the same main God. So Pi said, I'm gonna use that as an avenue to come in as a revivalist in the same way that we use the term today, as a reformer, and invite people to come back to their commitment to God. Because we've gone astray, and this has caused us to be weakened, and now all of these different empires around the world see us as a prey. And so we need to just reform. So I'm coming in, but I'm not coming in to dog y'all out and to oppress you. I'm coming in to help you get back on stable footing. But he also came in with his military. You know that at that time, and we're talking 747 BCE, which is before Christ, that Cush, I told you about the pupil, as an eye, the center of your eye, the pupil smiters. They had a mighty army, but they also had a navy. So they sailed up the Nile River in their with their fleet of ships. And it was interesting, it was easy to do because Cush was south, right, of Kemet, but the current of the river flows from south to north. So essentially all they had to do was put their boats in the water and do a little steering, and the current took them to where they wanted to go. So Pi came into Kemet. Also something that I didn't tell you last time, which encouraged Pi to come into Kemet with his army of pupil smiters and his navy, is that Libya, in the Libya that we know today, had some of the kings there had invaded and came into Kemet and were also setting up little small kingdoms. And for the most part, the people of Kemet were resistant and were reluctant and were unhappy that the people had come in from Kemet and rather from Libya and were taking over their territory. And they didn't worship the same God. The people of Libya did not worship the same God as the people of Kemet. So there was some openness to Pi. Pi saw that. And Pi came in and he conquered city after city. At that time, the place that was the capital, the religious capital and the political capital of Kemet was a place called Thebes, Thebes, Thebes. And so he went there and he set up his camp and he did what he said he was going to do. He rebuilt the temples. He commissioned new works of art. He promoted literacy. He promoted people growing their crops. He actually was an effective ruler of Kemet. As I said, everyone didn't welcome him with open arms, but many did. Because at the end of the day, what most people want is just stability and predictability. And he brought that back. At the time that he came in, everything was topsy-turvy. We talked about this also last week, that throughout its 3,100 years, there were 3 periods of time where the central government disintegrated. That was referred to as intermediate periods. And Pi and Cush comes in on one of these intermediate periods and reestablishes and reunites Egypt. So actually, he's a healer. Now, why is that important? Because it is in that context, that historical context, that ultimately the 25th dynasty forms a friendly alliance with the place that you may know from the Bible called Judah. How many of you heard of the country of Judah?
Yep, definitely.
How many of you have heard of a man named Hezekiah?
Yep.
Yep.
So at the time that all of this is happening, there's this emerging superpower that would be that would be comparable to China and Russia today, called Assyria. How many of you have heard of Assyria?
Yep.
Yep.
Assyria is just taking over the globe, cutting through Europe, or rather, East Europe, all of Asia, like a hot knife in butter. And you've got little Judah down there trying to hold its own, building walled cities, a reasonably decent army, but not world renowned for anything. So Judah reaches out to Kemet during the time that the Black pharaohs were in charge. Okay, so you've read this story before in the Bible, but you didn't know historically it was at the time after Pi had come in there and reunited and reinvigorated and reestablished and put Kemet back on stable footing. So Judah begins to reach out and say, hey, let's form an alliance. An alliance, what's an alliance? Well, NATO is an alliance. How many of you know, have heard the term NATO before?
Yes.
It's in the news recently. What NATO is it stands for the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was formed after World War II. And what it said is, okay, we're all going to be in this relationship. If a country attacks anybody in this group, then it's an attack on all of us, and we all go to war. Now we're dealing with that right now as we sit here. We're dealing with the issue that the former Soviet Union, which is Russia, is now threatening. What's his neighbor? Ukraine. Thank you, Ukraine. But the issue is we're trying to do a delicate dance because Ukraine is not in NATO, and the whole thing that Russia is saying is that we don't want Ukraine to ever get into to NATO. Because if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, then Russia knows that if they attack Ukraine, then that means that the United States and Great Britain and Germany and France and Spain has to come with their military and fight against Russia. Now, why is all that important? Because in the day that the Assyrians came up against Judah, there was a NATO type agreement between Kemet and Judah. But what started all of that was the Cushite people coming into Kemet and setting up or reestablishing really the Kemetic government. It had existed for thousands of years at that point. But they brought a renewal. They were revivalists, and they were religious purists. And in fact, before they went to war against Kemet, because Kemet some of the people at Kemet weren't welcoming them. They had an army. They put up some resistance. The Libyans helped gather an army, and they're going to fight it out. But before Pi's army actually attacked the city, the main city for the main battle, what he told his people to do is don't you lift a bow, don't you point an arrow, don't you pull your knives out, go to the river and wash yourselves and spend some time praying and meditating and reflecting. Because we are not just on a political mission, our military mission, we're on a spiritual mission. So that's what gave them that extra in their fighting that they did, is that they always believed that they were acting as instruments in the hand of God. All right. And they were world renowned. That's the only reason why Judah was reaching out to them, okay? Because they knew that these people were fierce warriors and reliable allies. All right, so in that context, we've discussed Pi only in the sense that he was one of the 20, he wasn't the first king in the 25th dynasty, but he was the one that actually went into Kemet and toppled the interlopers, the ones who had come in, who set up kingdoms and fiefdoms, who really didn't have a right to. He pushed back against the priests who were garnering power that they were not entitled to. So after Pianke died, at some point, a person that we will now discuss, who's mentioned directly in the Bible, is a man named Taharaka. I am going to try to share my screen with you again, so we can look at the scripture. I'm sorry. Someone's been trying to get in. I apologize for that. But please forgive me. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys. All right. Now, we've been discussing by way of narrative who Taharaka is. I want to show you in the Bible. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that it's talking about the same person, but they spell his name differently. I do some research in what is called ancestry. I don't know if any of you have ever done research in ancestry. My last name is spelled Girley today. But if you go back to the 1920 census, my grandfather and my great-grandfather spelled their name Gurley. If you look at some of the census, I see my grandfather's name or my great-grandfather's name spelled Gully, Gourley, Gilly. Same people, just alternate spelling. And in the same way, when we get to this passage of scripture that we're about to click on, we'll see Taharaka spelling his name, or the Bible spelling his name. So Taharaka, this guy, and now you have some context of who this guy is. He's referred to as someone, the king of Egypt, but you wouldn't know that he was a black man if you didn't have all of this history that we're discussing right now. Let's go to the passage. Can you see the passage?
Yep.
And when he heard who, now you got to understand who the he is. The he is that, so first of all, let me just give you a little bit of history. The Assyrians had actually come in and dominated Israel, well, not Israel, but Judah.
Judah.
And there was some type of an arrangement where they were going to have to pay tribute. That's what kings did. They went in for the money. We're going to dominate you, and you're going to have to pay us tribute, so much per year. And Judah had rose up and said to the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, we're not paying you a dime. We're just as sovereign and independent as you. And so Sennacherib said, oh yeah, I'll be down there just in a minute. As soon as I get my chariot together, I'll be down there to deal with this. And so he's coming down there, and then Hezekiah reaches out to his buddies, the Kemetic people specifically, though. Now, 2 Kings 19:9, and when he heard saying to Taharaka, the he that he's referring to here is Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, not to be confused with Syria, but Assyria, the empire. Heard say Taharaka, do you see that name?
Mm-hmm.
King of Ethiopia, behold, he has come out to fight against thee. He sent messengers again unto Hezekiah, saying, thus shalt you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, let not thy God in whom thou trustest deceive thee, saying, Jerusalem shall not be delivered into the hands of the king of Assyria. Behold, thou hast heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands by destroying them utterly, and shalt thou be delivered? Now, what Sennacherib is doing is trying to get inside Hezekiah's head. He's like, man, listen, I heard that you went and you sent for Taharaka and them boys down in Egypt, but don't think that God can deliver you. Man, I've been tearing people up, and the same thing's going to happen to you. That's a scare tactic. That's what bullies do, right? Don't resist, don't fight.
Yep.
Just shut up and take it. It's gonna be worse if you fight me. Give me your lunch money. And that's what Sennacherib was saying. But what I'm just pointing out to you here is that Hezekiah has reached out. There he is. He's literally in the Bible. I've read this passage before. I never knew that, but what it says, Taharaka, the king of Ethiopia. Let's do a little bit of review. When the Bible uses the term Ethiopia, is it talking about the country that exists today?
No.
No.
What country is it making reference to? More than likely, based upon what we know.
Egypt.
Egypt, Kemet, but also there's a place south of Kemet, which is what? That was at this time. These kings came from Napata, Karma, Merowe. Those were all the capitals of what empire? We discussed 2 empires last week.
Cush.
Cush, right? Cush. Now, so when the scriptures is using the term Ethiopia, it's referencing Cush here. Everybody that lived south of Kemet was Cushite or Ethiopian as far as they were concerned. Remember, Ethiopian is a relatively new term that was created by the Greeks, which meant the people of the blank-faced people. What is that? What is it?
Black face.
The what?
Black or
Black
burnt?
face.
The burnt-faced people.
Burnt face.
Burnt, yes.
The burnt. And you know, you guys, we've incorporated some of this in our I'm gonna stop sharing. We've incorporated some of this in our conversations with each other as Black people, right? Don't be out in the sun too long, or what's gonna happen?
You're gonna get burnt.
You're gonna get burnt.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna get black. Being out in the sun make you black. You're gonna get through that. You're black because you've been out in the sun too long. So the Greeks encountered these people from the heart of Africa, and they refer to them descriptively as the burnt-faced people, relative and comparatively speaking, as they're looking at themselves and they're looking at these people and they see that dark skin and they say, wow, these people must have been burnt. But we know from last year's discussion that it's not that we were burnt. Dark skin, folks, is directly related to how close to the equator you live. We discussed this last year, right? That the reason why we have dark skin is that it is a protection from the rays of the sun. Too much exposure can cause skin cancer. We know that, right?
Yep.
So then you need dark skin if you live in hot climates, period. If you live near in a place in an environment where there's a lot of sun. You need lighter skin if you live in an environment where there's not enough sun, because you got to have a certain amount of sun to get vitamin D. Do you know that we actually get nourishment from the sun?
Mm-hmm.
You know that if you live in a place where there's not a lot of sun over an extended period of time, that it can affect your state of mind?
Mm-hmm.
There's a place that you may have heard of called Seattle, Washington. There was a
High suicide rate.
study done where people were feeling gloomy and depressed all the time, but it rains a lot there. They don't get much sun there. So this skin, this dark skin that we live in, Black people, is a gift from God. And that totally refutes some of the Western theology that historically has been presented to us, that our Black skin is a sign of God's curse on us, the Hamitic curse, all of that nonsense that we talked about last year. Folks, we're coming close to the end of my presentation, and I do have time left after that for questions. And in fact, maybe I'll get to some of the questions and I'll draw from the material. But let me stop sharing. Let me go back to my outline. I'll continue to talk. Now, what I'll tell you is that, does anyone know what happened when Taharaka came to the support and the rescue of Judah? The first time that the Assyrians were at the gate, can anyone tell me what happened to them? Does anyone know?
Mm-mm.
All right.
They defeated them.
For time's sake, and it's in the Old Testament there. It's right there in 2 Kings. The the Bible says that an angel of the Lord came into the camp and killed 180,000 of them. Historians say that there was a fight that involved Taharaka and all of his army. Either way we go, what we know for sure is that the Assyrians didn't win anything. They went back home defeated and busted. And it's interesting to know that this black man played some role in it. He was clearly black. Why they refer to him as the king of Ethiopia is because when the Cushite kings took over and formed the 25th dynasty in Kemet, they also continued to rule over Cush. So they were the rulers of Cush and Kemet at the same time. So that's why the Bible refers to them as being Ethiopians, but we know they are Cushites. All right. So the first time that the Assyrians came up, they got defeated. But that didn't deter them. They came back a second time, and they had a second battle involving Taharaka and Kemet. And guess what happened the second time? They were defeated. That didn't deter them. They came back a third time. And in that
time they won. They were successful.
In that third battle, they were able to get the upper hand on Taharaka, and they chased him out of Kemet. They seriously injured him to the point where he was in danger of dying. So he didn't go away somewhere and lick his wounds. He went back to Napata. What is Napata? We talked about Napata or Napata. It's the second capital of Kush. So he went home and he spent time getting better. But in that last battle, they conquered Kemet for a moment, because if you read on into the 25th dynasty, that kind of went back and forth. The king that came after Taharaka actually was able to recapture Kemet a second time and to drive the Assyrians out. So this went back and forth. But as far as Taharaka is concerned, and we're mentioning Taharaka because he is a black man who's in the Bible, doing something in support of the people and the places of God. This is why we're having this conversation today, ladies and gentlemen, and we're almost through. I'm going to share my screen with you to give you this picture of Taharaka, because this is actually him, and you tell me whether or not he looks like a black man to you. Do you see a picture of a man?
Yep.
That's Taharaka. That is Taharaka. He died in Napata. He never went back to Kemet. But he is recognized by the historians, the Egyptologists, as being the greatest pharaoh of the 25th dynasty. In all, I've been told that there were a total of, in the 3,100 years that Kemet existed, there were maybe 300 rulers. But he's one of the greatest, both in terms of being from Cush and from also, let me stop sharing here. So he's one of the greatest kings, and he was a black man. And we should know about this guy, Taharaka. His name is spelled alternatively in the scriptures, but he's the same guy. And there's really no dispute among scholars about that. We're at 11 o'clock. What's really going to help, guys, if you look at the outline and click on the links are there for you to benefit from, okay? And I'm really at the end of the material that I had for today. Now I have some questions. Let's see if we can get some answers. Who was the father of the biblical character that we know as Canaan? Class. Who was Canaan's father?
Ham.
Ham, that's right. which biblical books discuss the priesthood of Melchizedek? Which books in the Bible discuss Melchizedek?
Genesis, the 14th chapter, and Psalms 110.
Right, and we went to those, but there's one more area of scripture in the New Testament. Can anyone tell me what that is?
Darn it. Hebrews.
Hebrews, that's right. Hebrews chapter 7 and 5, I believe also.
5, 6 is yes.
Talks about it. Paul, the consummate teacher, talks about how Jesus is compared to Melchizedek. He's a high priest, not after the order of the Levites, but after the order of Melchizedek. I put some emphasis earlier today on the fact one way he's like that is that he's both a king and a priest, which the Levites were just priests. Who was Pianke or Pi?
He was a pharaoh in the 25th
Pharaoh.
dynasty.
He was a pharaoh. What made him interesting? Why there were 7, but why did we talk about Pianke? What did he do?
Okay, let me see what he did. Hold on a minute.
We discussed it in class today.
He invaded Kemet.
He invaded Kemet. He actually went in and tried to reform, and in fact, he did reform, bring about religious reform.
Their morals were falling apart.
It had fallen apart.
Yeah.
And again, one of the lessons of history is that every empire rises and falls. And very often, it's not from the outside, right? The reason why Kemet could be invaded in the first place by the Libyans and then ultimately by the Cushites and by the Assyrians was what was happening on the inside.
Yeah.
I think that this is a cautionary tale for the United States of America. It's my thought. See what else I have here.
Who was that second pharaoh?
Taharaka.
Taharaka.
Taharaka was actually in the line of Cushite pharaohs. He was the 5th Cushite pharaoh.
No, I'm talking about the second after Alara.
Kashta, K-A-S-H-T-A, Kashta was the 2nd pharaoh in the line of the 7 pharaohs, which made up the 25th dynasty. Kashta.
You gave us the name for the 6th and the 7th?
No, but would you
No.
like to know? I can give them to you. Let's start with Alara. I'll have to count them on my hand. I knew someone would ask me this, so I went back and did a little.
Yeah, I had all my numbers down, so
Okay,
to put them all
right.
down.
So there's Alara, Kashta, Pianki, Shabaka, Taharka, and this one don't ask me to spell this one because I don't have it in front of me, but his name was Shabitku.
Who?
Yeah, that guy. Shabitku.
That's number 6. Okay.
The last one was Tantamani, so that should be 7. Tantamani was the last pharaoh that.
How you spell that?
Okay, I'm gonna go out on a limb here. Is T-A-T-A Tanta T-A-N-T.
I spell it like it sounds.
Yeah, no. Give me I don't have my pen.
Put the money at the end of it.
T-A-M-A-N-I, Tantamani. I believe that's how it's spelled.
Okay.
Again, it's in your material. If you click on one of those links, you'll find it. But Tantamani was the last one, and he was driven out of Kemet finally by the Assyrians, never to return. But those are the 7 pharaohs that made up the Cushite dynasty. I appreciate the questions. Let me keep going. Narmer. What color was Narmer? And this is just based upon your observation.
Well, his picture, he looks very black to me.
He's black. He was a burnt face.
He was a burned face, right?
He was burnt. Been out in the sun too long.
Which biblical books discuss Taharaka?
So the Psalms, hold on a minute.
We read one.
I know.
The other one is in the outline.
Second Kings.
Second Kings and
Second Kings. And the other one is in your outline.
Isaiah.
Isaiah talks about the same incident, because when the Assyrians came and they threw down the gauntlet, like, I know you ain't gonna trust your God. These other people trusted their God, and look what happened to them. Well, what Hezekiah did is he ran to the prophet and said, do you see what's going on? This dude trying to pick a fight with me, and I didn't even do nothing. I mean, got to put some emotions into that. I'm just trying to take care of my business. He trying to start a fight with me. And essentially the word of the Lord came through the prophet Isaiah and said, don't worry about nothing. That dude ain't gonna shoot one arrow in your capital. Not that he's not gonna win. He's not gonna shoot one arrow. And we know that, in fact, that's what happened, that the Assyrian army was defeated. There was an abysmal failure that day. But not only that, for those of you that are biblical scholars, do we know what happened to Sennacherib after that?
That's a Brother Paul question.
Huh?
I say that's a Brother Paul question.
Oh, okay. So what happened to him is that when he went back to his kingdom and he was in his temple praying to his God, that his sons killed him. His sons killed him.
That story. Snuck up on him and killed him.
Killed him while he was praying in the temple. And the reason why they killed him is because Sennacherib decided that he was going to make his youngest son his successor, who in fact became his successor. His younger son's name was Esarhaddon. Well, the older sons thought that they'd been slighted, they'd been overlooked. So they said, we'll handle this. And they did. Let's see if we have one more. And if you have questions, by all means, you can ask your questions. Let me know if you have questions. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Let me see if I have one more question.
I have a question
Yes.
in reference to your question, which is number 16. Was the 25th dynasty the only time that Black pharaohs ruled Kemet?
Well, we've been discussing that throughout our conversation, our ongoing conversation. Class, what do you think? Based upon what we've discussed?
No.
No. Why? Why can we confidently say that? Who was the first pharaoh of Kemet, the United Kingdom?
I have to go back on that one.
From last week. We just
Oh.
mentioned him a moment
I'm
ago.
gonna get my last week's stuff out.
Who's the guy who
Siesto?
no,
Right. Okay, wait a minute. Hold on.
let me find. While you going there, I'm gonna do something. All right, here we go. Here's some help.
Okay.
Can y'all see that?
Yes.
That guy to the left. Does that refresh you anyway? In any way?
Narmer?
Narmer.
Narmer, first pharaoh.
Narmer.
So the question that Terry asked was, and it's a question 16 in the outline, was the 25th dynasty the only time that Black pharaohs ruled Kemet? Well, if this guy is the first ruler of Kemet, what do you think?
No.
No,
No.
and he was not. He was not a part of the 25th dynasty. He's a Black man. How about this guy, Amenhotep III? He was not a part of the 25th dynasty, and he was a ruler of Kemet. How about this guy, Mentenhotep II? And by the way, when we visited the Met, I guess that was, when were we in New York? I can't, November? We went to the Metropolitan, the art museum there, and they have a whole exhibit on Egypt. And we saw this guy here, pretty imposing figure. He's Black in my thinking, and from what I can determine, and he was not a part of the 25th dynasty. He ruled somewhere, don't quote me on this, don't hold me to this, somewhere around 1501 BCE. That is 1,500 years before Christ's birth. Whereas the 25th dynasty, Pianki invaded Egypt somewhere around 747 BCE.
Okay.
So about 750 years before. It's this guy right here, 750 years before the 25th dynasty. And he looks Black to me. So to answer the question, and the reason why the question is there, it's accurate to say that the 25th dynasty was exclusively Black, but it is not accurate to say that the 25th dynasty was the only time that Black people ruled Kemet or Egypt, because there are many times, beginning at the first, the founding of Kemet. Well, folks, I don't want to prolong this. You guys have been very attentive and patient as we try to work through some technical challenges, but hopefully you're getting the material and you're seeing the Bible and seeing the biblical characters come to life. Hopefully it's sparking an interest and you're doing that additional inquiry, because the only thing I can do is try to awaken your consciousness about the fact that God's got a plan for the Black man and the Black woman. And we are in the center of his hand, and we are in the center of his plan. And we will continue our conversation next week about Africa's contribution, people, and the places of the Bible. If there are no further questions, we are going to adjourn class. Not seeing any further questions or comments, not seeing any comments in the chat. Have a blessed day. Thank you for participating.
Right.